I'm Alina, I'm 30 years old, and right now, I'm sitting in a cold mahogany courtroom watching my husband of 7 years chuckle under his breath as he signs our divorce decree. Julian always operated under the assumption that I was just an uninspired, small town girl from Ohio with no real drive. What his arrogant mind couldn't fathom was that while he was busy engaging in a cliche affair with his firm's new marketing director, I was quietly constructing a financial empire right beneath his nose. The judge is preparing to read my finalized asset disclosure statement, and I absolutely cannot wait to watch that patronizing smirk completely vanish from his face. Before I reveal exactly how my soon-to-be ex-husband's expression transformed from smug superiority to absolute horror, do me a favor. Let me know in the comments below where you are tuning in from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to quietly stand up for yourself when absolutely nobody believed you were capable. I grew up in a quiet, working-class town in Ohio before moving to Chicago to study corporate statistical analysis and economics at Northwestern University. I possessed massive ambitions of breaking into high-level asset management, fueled by a humble upbringing where my parents instilled in me a fierce respect for fiscal discipline, meticulous saving, and self-reliance. Those early lessons would later become my greatest weapons. I met Julian at an upscale bistro just off the university campus. I was buried under a mountain of data sheets, intensely preparing for advanced portfolio management exam when he casually slid into the booth across from me. He was a final-year corporate litigation student from a prestigious line of old-money Chicago attorneys, and he carried that effortlessly dismissive confidence that only belongs to people who have never looked at a price tag in their entire lives. "You clearly have raw talent, you just happen to lack the right curation," were the very first words that left his mouth as he glanced down at my heavily highlighted textbook. At 21, I foolishly mistook his condescension for intellectual charm. Now I recognize it as both an insult and the blueprint for our entire relationship. He seemed flawless on paper, driven, wealthy, charismatic, and intensely focused on me. Our initial romance was a total whirlwind. Julian swept me away to Michelin-star restaurants I could never dream of affording, organized spontaneous weekend getaways to Aspen, and introduced me to a world of luxury I had only ever witnessed on television screens. But right from the starting gates, his affection came with strings. He was constantly attempting to refine my personal style and alter my social circle. He subtly criticized my department store clothes, pressured me to style my hair in a more metropolitan fashion, and dropped passive-aggressive remarks about my childhood friends having a terribly restricted worldview. At the time, I was bringing in a modest, entry-level income working part-time as a data analyst at a local boutique logistics firm. I genuinely loved the work, the complex problem-solving, the quiet thrill of predictive modeling, and the pure logic of data. Julian, however, consistently referred to my career as your little data project, and repeatedly implied that my employment was an unnecessary eccentricity. "Why are you exhausting your mental energy for pocket change when I am entirely capable of funding your lifestyle?" he would ask with a chuckle. He lacked the capacity to comprehend that my work was never about the money, it was about preserving my autonomy and my mind. After a year and a half of dating, he staged a highly public proposal during a lavish dinner in Aspen. The diamond was massive, the vintage champagne flowed freely, and the entire event was perfectly calibrated for maximum social optics. The surrounding patrons broke into applause on cue. It felt like a curated fairy tale, and I whispered yes without a second thought. Our wedding was a quiet, minimal ceremony in Savannah, Georgia, a deliberate choice of mine despite immense, suffocating pressure from his mother to host an ostentatious 500-person gala in downtown Chicago. Looking back, that was one of the incredibly rare moments where I successfully forced myself to stand firm against the overwhelming expectations of the Vance family. Well, at least the coastal backdrop is civilized, even if the execution is remarkably sparse, his mother, Alina, remarked to me with a frozen smile that never managed to reach her piercing eyes. That conversation gave me my first genuine taste of how the family viewed me, a charitable project, a blank canvas that wasn't quite worthy of their lineage. Following our honeymoon in Greece, we moved directly into his expansive estate in Lake Forest, one of Chicago's most exclusive old-money enclaves. The architecture was sleek, staggeringly expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth, a perfect mirror of his family's disposition. I tried to infuse the space with character, introducing vibrant artwork, personal travel photography, and lush greenery, but Julian systematically replaced my choices with cold, minimalist aesthetics designed to project calculated wealth rather than a shared life. The structural cracks in our marriage manifested within mere months. Julian cross-examined every single domestic purchase I made, openly critiqued my choice of professional associates, and took regular jabs at my evolving career trajectory. "Data entry is just so dreadfully administrative," he sneered one evening after briefly meeting a few of my colleagues. You possess the intelligence to be truly exceptional, Alina, yet you are completely squandering it on basic balance sheets for mid-sized companies that nobody in our circle has ever heard of. I spent the first 2 years trying desperately to blend into his social orbit, interacting with the spouses of corporate executives and corporate lawyers who spent their structured weeks bouncing between medical spas, luxury boutiques, and high society charity committees. They were perfectly pleasant to my face, but the underlying exclusion was tangible. I eventually overheard one of them at a fundraising gala refer to me behind my back as Julian's endearing little experiment with the working class. Instead of standing up for me when I confronted him, Julian later suggested that I simply needed to try a bit harder to assimilate, suggesting I overhaul my wardrobe entirely and perhaps pick up equestrian sports or tennis. They just need to observe that you are actively attempting to adapt to our standard of living, he explained casually, as though my fundamental identity was a crude clay sculpture meant to be remolded and corrected. Those initial years were a deeply disorienting blur of material luxury and profound, aching loneliness. I was constantly showered with expensive designer gifts while watching my sense of self-worth systematically erode. I was gradually morphing into the exact creature Julian desired, a polished, silent trophy wife who reflected beautifully on his social standing, while the fiercely independent analyst I used to be was slowly fading into obscurity. By our third year of marriage, the quiet tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface finally hit a boiling point. Julian had always been incredibly particular about financial control, but his behavior escalated into full-blown dominance. Despite our joint checking accounts, he audited every single personal purchase I made, while simultaneously dropping astronomical sums on his own hobbies without a single conversation. Did you truly need to spend $200 on advanced predictive modeling software and data analytics journals? He would ask during his weekend cross-examinations, staring intently at the printout of our credit card statement. That is capital that could have been placed into a high-yield index fund. Meanwhile, he thought absolutely nothing of spending $8,000 on a custom set of golf clubs or a new luxury watch. Gradually, I found myself completely cut off from my roots. Visits to see my parents in Ohio became non-existent because Julian always manufactured a seamless conflict. A critical partner dinner, an emergency client gala, or his favorite excuse. Rural Ohio is just far too provincial for my taste, Alina. My old university friends eventually stopped calling entirely after Julian made it blatantly obvious that they weren't sophisticated enough to cross our threshold. Your friend Maya actually asked if our imported Bordeaux was from a local supermarket. He sneered with a loud laugh after a dinner party I had spent days organizing, as if we would ever serve domestic table wine to our guests. It's deeply embarrassing, Alina. My career, which had once been my absolute pride, became a battleground. When my firm offered me a promotion to lead strategic data architect, Julian flatly refused to celebrate. Is that pathetic little bump in salary genuinely worth the extra hours away from your domestic responsibilities? He asked smoothly. We're supposed to be planning a family soon, remember? This was complete news to me. Whenever I had previously raised the topic of children, he had always dismissed it, claiming his trial schedule was far too demanding. It was during this exact pocket of isolation that I discovered my true calling, independent algorithmic asset consulting. The boutique firm I worked for was looking into advanced algorithmic wealth management, and I volunteered to spearhead the data modeling and risk assessment framework. I quickly realized I possessed an uncanny, near-superhuman talent for reading market inefficiencies and designing automated data-driven portfolios that generated massive, consistent yields. Thrilled by this massive breakthrough, I nervously shared my ultimate dream with Julian one evening, the idea of eventually launching my own boutique quantitative financial consulting firm. His reaction was utterly crushing. Alina, let's look at the data realistically. Launching a high-stakes consulting firm requires serious business acumen and elite networking, neither of which happen to be your strong suits. Besides, 90% of new startups collapse within 12 months. Why risk my family's social reputation on a whim? Our conflicting philosophies on wealth highlighted our fundamental incompatibility. Julian was obsessed with conspicuous consumption, the correct zip code, the proper luxury vehicle, the most exclusive European resorts, all meticulously orchestrated to project an image of supreme success. I, with my grounded, working-class upbringing, believed in silent accumulation, strategic compounding, and finding structural value rather than chasing a high price tag. As our fourth anniversary rolled around, Julian's late nights at his corporate law firm transformed from an occasional necessity into an absolute routine. A massive corporate merger, late-night depositions, quarterly board reviews. His excuses rotated constantly, but his physical absence remained entirely fixed. I ate my dinners alone in that massive, echoing kitchen. I went to bed alone, and I increasingly lived the life of a single woman, but with the added humiliation of navigating the strict financial surveillance of a child receiving an allowance. Our first explosive argument occurred right after his family's annual winter gala. During the tense drive back to Lake Forest, his mother had pointedly asked when I intended to finally produce an heir for the Vance legacy. I quietly mentioned that I was ready whenever Julian was, only for him to smoothly slice through the conversation and change the topic entirely. When I finally confronted him about it in the privacy of our bedroom, his reaction was icy. "Children are a monumental responsibility and a massive reputational expense," he said calmly, slowly loosening his designer silk tie. "With your incredibly modest background and my family's historic expectations, any child of mine will require elite trust funds, top-tier international boarding schools, and impeccable social connections from day one. To be completely blunt, Alina, we are simply not there yet financially." "Not there yet?" I asked, completely blindsided. "Julian, you pull in a massive high six-figure income. Your family sits on generations of Chicago real estate wealth. What on earth are we waiting for?" His response was a knife to the heart. "My family's money isn't the issue here. You still haven't established yourself or adjusted to this tier of society. What exactly would you be contributing to a child's future legacy?" The burning humiliation of his words festered inside me for weeks. His systematic dismissiveness toward my intellect, he had literally called my annual salary insignificant pocket change during another blowout, solidified an unshakable resolve within my chest. I desperately needed financial independence, not just as an exit strategy, but to preserve my sanity. That exact week, I quietly opened a private business bank account at an online-only institution Julian had never heard of. I set up a small, automated direct deposit from my biweekly paycheck. It was a modest enough sum that Julian wouldn't notice a discrepancy if he glanced at our joint checking records, but it was enough to start laying the first brick of my freedom. Simultaneously, I began aggressively educating myself on independent corporate structure, global asset protection, and venture capitalism. I devoured complex business texts, took advanced night courses on algorithmic trading, and studied venture capital frameworks. I did every single ounce of this research using highly secure, private browsing modes, terrified of leaving even a single digital breadcrumb for Julian or his tech-savvy law firm associates to stumble upon. The naive, starstruck girl who had once been swept off her feet by expensive dinners and grand gestures was officially dead. In her place, a calculated architect was waking up inside the gilded cage, meticulously plotting her escape, one data point at a time. While Julian continued to lose himself in his endless late-night client depositions, I quietly began laying the concrete foundations for my complete autonomy. Utilizing my carefully guarded private savings, I legally registered an independent corporate consulting entity under the name Vanguard Analytical Solutions. I built a sleek, password-protected, hyper-professional website showcasing my advanced statistical modeling portfolio and predictive market algorithms. My primary logistical hurdle was manufacturing the time required to scale my operation without triggering Julian's hypervigilant suspicion. I quietly converted our rarely utilized third-floor guest suite into a dedicated workspace. I casually explained to Julian that I was merely completing mandatory continuing education credits to maintain my status at the logistics firm. True to form, he barely processed the explanation, entirely dismissing my professional development as an endearing little hobby rather than a legitimate business venture. "Just ensure your little classes don't conflict with our country club dinner obligations this weekend," was his only real concern. My very first high-tier client materialized through a stroke of absolute luck at a boutique downtown espresso bar. I happened to overhear Sofia Ramirez, the brilliant founder of a rapidly scaling regional supply chain network, venting to her operations manager about the astronomical predatory retainer fees quoted by traditional corporate consulting firms. "I simply cannot justify dropping $15,000 on a preliminary financial optimization strategy when we are bleeding capital in our logistics chain and can't pinpoint the leak," she sighed heavily. Seizing the moment, I politely introduced myself, handed her my private business card, outlined my unique background in predictive analytics, and offered to completely overhaul her corporate data structure at a fraction of the market rate, on the condition that I could utilize her case study anonymously in my portfolio. Sophia decided to take a calculated risk on me, and the subsequent data results shattered every single expectation. I instantly isolated massive structural inefficiencies in her middle-mile distribution, completely restructured her vendor payment algorithms, and engineered a predictive cash flow strategy that skyrocketed her net quarterly returns by a staggering 40%. The logistical transformation was so dramatic that Sophia immediately began aggressively referring me to other high-net-worth founders within her elite entrepreneurial network. Working alongside Sophia didn't just hand me my first monumental professional success story, it gifted me an authentic, grounded friendship, something that had been painfully absent from Julian's heavily curated, superficial social circle. She was fiercely intelligent, incredibly hardworking, and valued my mind in a way my husband had never possessed the capacity to appreciate. "You possess a rare, frighteningly sharp gift, Alina," Sophia told me over lunch one afternoon. You read data patterns in a way that helps real business owners construct generational wealth. Don't you ever let that arrogant husband of yours dim your intellect. I worked grueling late-night hours while Julian was away on his increasingly frequent weekend conferences. I actually converted a deep walk-in cedar closet into a makeshift acoustic booth for private client consultations, using heavy wool blankets to completely dampen the sound of my late-night Zoom calls. Every single new client acquisition was an intoxicating blend of pure exhilaration and absolute terror. Exhilaration because my shadow empire was expanding exponentially, terror because a single slip-up or discovery by Julian would trigger an immediate domestic explosion. The operational learning curve was incredibly steep. In the beginning, I made classic mistakes, grossly undercharging for highly complex algorithmic overhauls and occasionally overpromising on exhausting deployment timelines. But I adapted with lightning speed. Each corporate client taught me invaluable lessons about setting non-negotiable boundaries, managing corporate client expectations, and properly valuing my own unique genius. I strategically funneled every single dollar of my corporate profits directly back into the business, purchasing cutting-edge statistical software and advanced server space, meticulously masking the digital transactions inside standard household grocery receipts or executing cash-only software licensing purchases. Over the course of 12 months, my client roster expanded rapidly, fueled entirely by quiet word-of-mouth recommendations among Chicago's underground tech and logistics founders. Instead of spending a dime of the revenue, I aggressively reinvested the capital into high-yield, private equity portfolios and strategic corporate investments. Julian remained completely oblivious, chalking up my sudden surge of confidence and poise to me finally adjusting to the luxury of the Vance lifestyle, completely blind to the fact that it was fueled by absolute professional fulfillment. A massive turning point occurred when I completely restructured the data framework for a struggling biotech startup founder. My algorithmic overhaul helped her flawlessly secure a highly coveted $15 million Series A funding round. The corporate success story was prominently featured in a major Midwest business journal. I had to firmly decline being mentioned by name or photographed, citing strict client confidentiality agreements, but the behind-the-scenes credibility it granted me opened the doors to massive, institutional-tier clients. Through Sophia's network, I was introduced to Vivienne Chen, a legendary venture capitalist who had successfully exited her previous tech conglomerate for an 8-figure sum and was currently launching a revolutionary Midwest fintech fund. Initially hiring Vanguard Analytical Solutions for a minor risk assessment audit, Vivienne rapidly transformed into both my most lucrative client and an invaluable mentor. "You are charging absolute pennies for the caliber of predictive data you are generating," Vivienne told me bluntly during a private strategy review. "Triple your consulting rates immediately, Alina, and watch how quickly the market shifts to match your perceived valuation." She was entirely right. The moment I aggressively raised my rates instead of losing clients, I suddenly attracted far more established, multi-million-dollar enterprises who were eager to pay a premium for flawless execution. Vivienne also introduced me to the high-stakes world of elite angel investing and private portfolio optimization. "Liquid capital loses its power sitting stagnant in a traditional bank account," she explained authoritatively. "You need to force your capital to work for you around the clock." Under her brilliant tutelage, I began making highly calculated private angel investments in high-growth startups, including Vivienne's own fintech venture, which specialized in AI-driven corporate forecasting software. I launched with small, manageable sums, but as Vanguard's revenue compounded, my private investment portfolio grew into an absolute juggernaut. The pure rush of watching both my consulting firm and my secret investments multiply was electric. For the absolute first time since saying I do to Julian, I felt entirely alive, fiercely purposeful, and completely sovereign. I was building something of monumental value, entirely on my own terms and by the sheer force of my own intellect. Throughout this entire intense chapter, I maintained the flawless illusion of being nothing more than Julian's dutiful, quiet wife at high society events. I smiled warmly and nodded politely when his colleagues' spouses gossiped about their luxury European shopping trips, Botox regimens, and upcoming charity galas. I attended his exhausting firm dinners and played the role of the supportive, silent partner flawlessly, all while secretly operating a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from a hidden closet and making high-stakes investment maneuvers that would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. My double life was entirely exhausting, but it was profoundly empowering. Every single client won, every successful data model deployed, and every massive investment yield was a direct step closer to the total freedom I now knew I desperately required. 4.5 years into our marriage, the meticulously polished facade Julian had built began to completely splinter. It initiated with a rogue text notification that flashed across Julian's phone screen while he was in the master shower. A brief, unmistakable preview was visible on his lock screen from a contact saved simply as A. It read, "Missing your touch already, last night was absolutely." The preview cut off there, and the notification was swept away by an automatic privacy timer before I could unlock the device, but it planted a cold, unshakable seed of suspicion deep in my chest. Julian had been increasingly detached for months, frequently returning home well past midnight smelling faintly of an unfamiliar, high-end white floral perfume. Whenever I questioned it, he smoothly brushed it off, claiming it was merely the residual scent of networking events and hugging corporate clients goodbye. Rather than executing a messy emotional confrontation immediately, my data-driven brain went straight to work. I began systematically tracking his operational patterns. The emergency Thursday evening depositions that miraculously always wrapped up precisely at 9:30 p.m., the weekend compliance seminars that curiously lacked any public digital footprint or corporate website. The sudden, exponential spike in premium business expenses at a specific hyper-exclusive rooftop restaurant downtown. The following Thursday, I casually informed Julian that I was heading into the city to assist Sophia with a major corporate catering launch for her network. Instead, I securely parked my SUV a block away from the downtown restaurant he frequented and waited in the shadows. At exactly 8:15 p.m., his black Porsche pulled smoothly into the valet circle. Less than 10 minutes later, a sleek red Mercedes coupe pulled up directly behind him. A striking, elegant woman with sharp blonde hair stepped out. Even from a distance, I instantly recognized Alyssa Vance, no relation, ironically, the ambitious new marketing director Julian's law firm had hired 6 months prior. I watched them embrace in a manner that no corporate colleagues ever would. I watched him pull her into a slow, intimate kiss right there in the valet zone before they walked into the restaurant hand in hand. My hands began to tremble violently against the steering wheel as I raised my phone to capture crystal-clear, high-resolution photographs. My stomach twisted into a hollow pit of raw betrayal, mixed with cold, mathematical confirmation. I gave them exactly 30 minutes to settle in before I unbuckled my seatbelt and walked straight into the establishment. I located them at a secluded corner booth in the back, his hand draped casually over hers, leaning in so close their foreheads practically touched. I approached the table entirely in silence, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I was certain the surrounding patrons could hear it. "So this is the legal data required for the late-night depositions," I said, my voice shockingly calm and completely level. Julian violently recoiled, his face instantly cycling through profound shock, sudden guilt, and finally settling into a mask of deep irritation at being caught out in the open. Alyssa had the basic decency to look thoroughly mortified, rapidly grabbing her designer handbag and muttering a desperate excuse about finding the ladies' room. "Alina, listen to me, this is absolutely not what it looks like," Julian began, immediately deploying that smooth, patronizing negotiation tone he utilized with difficult litigation opponents. "Really, Julian? Because to a data analyst, it looks exactly like you are feeding expensive dinners to your mistress, while your wife sits at home under the impression that you are billing hours." The dialogue that followed was entirely surreal. Julian offered a hollow, half-hearted apology, dismissively claimed the arrangement was purely physical, and then possessed the absolute audacity to turn the blame entirely back on me for his infidelity. "You've been completely wrapped up in your little data certificates and night classes," he hissed, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper as neighboring diners began to turn their heads toward our table. "You've become completely stagnant, Alina, boring, unambitious. When was the absolute last time you actually invested an ounce of effort into our marriage?" I turned and walked out of the restaurant without uttering another word, driving aimlessly through the Chicago grid for hours before finally returning to Lake Forest. Julian arrived past midnight, unleashing an avalanche of desperate promises to terminate the affair immediately, suggesting intensive marriage counseling and even proposing a month-long trip to Paris. For reasons I didn't fully comprehend in that exact moment, I instinctively feigned considering a reconciliation. "I just require time to process this," I told him quietly. It wasn't a lie, It wasn't a lie, I desperately required time, not to forgive his betrayal, but to mathematically calculate my next legal maneuvers. The subsequent weeks were an absolute masterclass in mutual deception. Julian transformed into a temporarily hyperattentive partner, ordering elaborate flower arrangements to the house and organizing elaborate date nights, while I secretly spent my afternoons consulting with high-stakes divorce attorneys under the guise of off-site client meetings. Vivienne introduced me to Rebecca Torres, a formidable, legendary family law attorney known across Chicago for dismantling complex corporate assets. Rebecca laid out the legal reality of my situation with chilling precision. "Illinois operates under equitable distribution," she explained, reviewing my file. "Without a restrictive prenuptial agreement, the court will divide marital property based on what they deem fair, which doesn't automatically translate to an exact 50-50 split. We need to map out every single piece of your financial entanglement, expose the generational family assets, and document everything meticulously. In high-stakes divorce, financial data is absolute leverage. My cautious, calculated information gathering came to a screeching halt 3 weeks later when Julian accidentally discovered my search history on our shared home iMac. In a moment of pure exhaustion, I had forgotten to activate a private browsing window for a single, critical search: Illinois divorce asset distribution and hidden corporate accounts. His explosive rage was immediate, terrifying, and completely unhinged. He cornered me in our minimalist kitchen, aggressively waving his phone with a screenshot of the history pane he had taken. "Is this what you've been doing behind my back, planning to betray me and come after my family's money?" His face was bright crimson, a thick vein pulsing violently near his temple. "Let me make this crystal clear to you, Alina. You will walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing. Nothing. My family's corporate attorneys will completely bury you before you even see a courtroom." I forced myself to remain completely immobile and calm, which only infuriated his ego further. "I'm not planning an attack, Julian. I was simply researching my options out of pure fear after catching you with Alyssa. Wouldn't any rational person do the exact same?" He seemed temporarily mollified by my submissive explanation, but the physical threat hung heavily in the air between us. That very night, I migrated every single scrap of Vanguard Analytical Solutions corporate data to hypersecure, military-grade cloud server and transferred my digital financial records onto encrypted physical drives, storing them securely in a private safety deposit box at a bank Julian didn't even know existed. The ultimate breakthrough dropped exactly 3 weeks later. While methodically deep-cleaning our master closet, a domestic chore Julian considered entirely beneath his dignity, I discovered a crisp luxury jewelry receipt tucked deep inside one of his custom Italian leather dress shoes. It was from Tiffany & Co., dated precisely 2 months prior, for a diamond tennis bracelet totaling an astronomical $14,000. I had never received that bracelet. Even with full knowledge of his ongoing affair, this tangible, hard evidence of him actively investing our shared household capital into another woman stung with a sharp, visceral intensity I hadn't prepared for. The receipt clearly demonstrated that he was utilizing our marital assets to fund Alyssa's luxury lifestyle. Before I could even fully process this new layer of betrayal, I heard the heavy front door click open down the hall. Laughter echoed into the entryway, Julian's voice, accompanied by a woman's distinct giggling. I froze completely inside the deep walk-in closet as they walked straight into our master bedroom, clearly operating under the assumption that I was locked away at my corporate data office in the city until late evening. I calmly stepped out of the shadows of the closet to find Julian and Alyssa passionately embracing right at the foot of our bed, the exact bed I had slept in for 7 years. "Alina," Julian gasped, not even bothered to instantly break physical contact with her. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the office." "I took a half day," I replied, astonished by the chilling, absolute composure of my own voice. Clearly, I should have sent a calendar invite first. What followed wasn't the screaming, emotional breakdown that Hollywood scripts prepare you for. Instead, Julian instantly pivoted into a cold, transactional pragmatism. "Well, frankly, this saves me the logistical headache of a difficult conversation," he said smoothly, calmly adjusting his cuffs. "I want a divorce, Alina. Alyssa and I are building a real future together." His confidence was completely absolute as he coldly dictated his terms. "I will generously permit you to retain your personal wardrobe and a modest cash settlement to help you get back on your feet in a smaller apartment. The Lake Forest estate, our mutual investment portfolios, and the custom furnishings remain entirely mine. My legal team will be in formal communication tomorrow," he concluded, appearing mildly perplexed by my complete lack of tears or hysteria. "You should probably locate alternative lodging starting tonight." "Actually," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "since this estate is legally registered as my primary residence as well, I think I'll be staying right here. You and Alyssa are more than welcome to source a luxury hotel room." His face darkened instantly at my defiance, but Alyssa nervously tugged at his arm. "Let's just go, Julian. We can let the attorneys handle this mess tomorrow." As they turned to exit the bedroom, Julian paused, delivering one final, venomous parting shot over his shoulder. "You are going to deeply regret turning down my initial generosity, Alina. By the time my family's litigators are finished processing you, you'll be incredibly lucky if you can afford a rundown studio apartment in the worst zip code in Chicago." I waited until the front door slammed shut, leaned back against the mahogany door frame, and for the absolute first time since uncovering his infidelity, a slow smile spread across my face. Julian had absolutely no idea the storm that was coming for him. The morning after I evicted Julian and Alyssa from our bedroom, he had a moving crew clear out the majority of his designer wardrobe and personal artifacts. I had an elite security locksmith change every single entry code and physical lock on the Lake Forest estate that very afternoon. It was a legally aggressive move that Rebecca warned me might ruffle the judge's feathers, but it bought me the absolute peace of mind required to catalog every single piece of high-value asset remaining in the house before his family could surreptitiously strip the property clean. Julian's profound arrogance regarding my financial intellect became hilariously transparent the moment his legal team fired over their initial settlement proposal. They offered a single lump sum payout of $60,000 and exactly 6 months of basic living expenses. In exchange, I was expected to permanently waive all claims to his law firm equity, the generational family real estate portfolios, and the very estate I had physically managed and maintained for over 4 years. He's merely testing your baseline psychological limits, Rebecca chuckled over a secure encrypted call as I walked her through the insulting paperwork. He is operating entirely under the delusion that you are broke, terrified, and fundamentally ignorant of your marital rights. He wants to drain your resolve. With Rebecca's sharp guidance, I formally executed a flat, cold rejection of their offer and immediately initiated the formal process of judicial financial discovery, a powerful legal mechanism that forced both parties to disclose every single asset, offshore account, corporate liability, and stream of income under penalty of perjury. Julian's immediate counter-strategy was to have his high-priced attorney, David Harrison, systematically delay, file extensions, and obfuscate their financial disclosures at every single turn. This is page 1 of the old money playbook, Rebecca assured me calmly. They are actively banking on the assumption that you lack the liquid capital to sustain a protracted legal war of attrition. They want to starve you out until you desperately sign whatever scraps they throw on the table. What Julian's legal team failed to calculate was that I wasn't waiting around for their reluctant disclosures. I had been quietly, mathematically tracking our joint financial transactions for nearly 3 years, cataloging secret investment accounts Julian assumed I was too simple-minded to ever locate. More importantly, Vanguard Analytical Solutions was generating massive, uncompromised streams of private capital that he knew absolutely nothing about. After a deep strategic consultation with Rebecca, we made a highly calculated tactical choice. I would completely withhold the true multi-million-dollar scale of my algorithmic consulting firm and asset portfolios during the initial, preliminary phases of the legal negotiation. Illinois law generally viewed corporate enterprises launched during a marriage to be marital property subject to split. However, Rebecca identified an incredible legal vulnerability in Julian's past behavior. Because Julian had explicitly, repeatedly discouraged my entrepreneurship in writing and provided zero financial, emotional, or structural support for its execution, we could petition to class the entire firm as exclusive separate property. We will unveil the full scope of your empire at the absolute perfect moment of maximum leverage, Rebecca smiled with cold precision. For now, let him continue to run his mouth and construct his own fictional narrative about your financial desperation. While the bureaucratic legal machinery ground forward at a glacial pace, Julian launched a brutal social scorched earth campaign. Suddenly, mutual country club friends completely stopped returning my texts. Elite charity gala invitations vanished from my mailbox. Even our immediate Lake Forest neighbors who had spent years sipping wine on our patio suddenly treated me with cold, sterile professional distance whenever we crossed paths. I eventually discovered through Sophia that Julian had been aggressively spreading a meticulous, fabricated narrative across Chicago's elite social circles. He was telling anyone who would listen that I had been systematically unfaithful to him, that I was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown, and that he was reluctantly pursuing a divorce despite exhausting all his personal resources trying to save me. In the high society enclaves where the Vance family name carried massive generational weight, his calculated fiction was accepted as gospel truth without a single question. The sting of this sudden social exile was sharper than I had anticipated. Individuals I had shared holidays with, celebrated massive life milestones with, and trusted with private confidences vanished overnight based entirely on Julian's smooth lies. The only people who didn't waver for a single fraction of a second were Sophia and Vivienne. Weak individuals who consume toxic gossip without demanding the raw data from both sides are an absolute waste of your analytical energy, Alina, Sophia told me fiercely, handing me a fresh espresso in her humming distribution headquarters after an exhausting legal deposition. Focus 100% of your processing power on constructing your new kingdom. Never waste time mourning a burning house. Julian's aggressive attempts to psychologically intimidate me escalated dramatically the moment he realized I wasn't going to roll over and quietly accept his garbage settlement terms. I began receiving late-night phone calls filled with tightly veiled, venomous corporate threats. I will personally ensure your name is completely blacklisted from every major analytical firm in the Midwest, Alina, he hissed into the receiver during one particular late-night tirade. He even went so far as to threaten to launch an anonymous corporate audit against Vanguard for tax irregularities, a hilariously empty threat, given that my corporate accounting and tax structures were organized with absolute mathematical perfection. His mother, Alina, eventually stepped in to apply matriarchal pressure, calling me under the guise of an intervention. "We always recognized deep down that your background wasn't properly aligned with Julian's trajectory," she said, her voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "But we graciously accepted you into our home because our son chose you. Do not make this vulgar, Alina. Accept the generous terms being offered, sign the papers, and depart with a modicum of your dignity intact." I maintained a perfectly flat, unreadable composure throughout her entire speech, a skill I had perfected over 7 years of enduring her subtle, toxic jabs at Vance family dinners. "I deeply appreciate your perspective, Alina," I replied smoothly. "However, I will continue to be guided exclusively by the advice of my legal counsel." Julian's supreme overconfidence ultimately became his greatest structural vulnerability. Operating under the blind delusion that I possessed zero independent capital to finance a prolonged court battle, he began making massive, unforced operational errors. He completely failed to disclose 2 major offshore investment accounts that I already held direct cryptographic receipts for. He grossly underreported the true valuation of his law firm equity shares. He confidently claimed that several high-yield stock portfolios were exclusive premarital separate property, when I possessed data showing they had been thoroughly commingled with marital funds during our 3rd year. Rebecca logged every single digital discrepancy with predatory precision, constructing a bulletproof trap that would completely dismantle his credibility before a federal judge. Meanwhile, completely detached from the toxic legal drama, Vanguard Analytical Solutions experienced an absolute explosion of growth during our separation. An advanced predictive algorithm I engineered for a massive Midwest logistics conglomerate helped them completely avoid a catastrophic supply chain collapse, effectively tripling their net operational profits in under 90 days. The triumph led to high-profile features in major national financial publications. I steadfastly declined all personal interviews and cover photos, citing strict corporate privacy mandates, but the massive industry prestige triggered an absolute avalanche of institutional-tier corporate clients. The definitive macroeconomic breakthrough materialized when I successfully secured an exclusive enterprise contract to overhaul the entire financial data architecture for a massive national retail giant, a multi-million-dollar corporate transaction that permanently catapulted Vanguard from a successful boutique firm into an absolute market juggernaut. I instantly hired a team of elite data scientists, leased a stunning ultra-modern corporate suite overlooking the Chicago skyline, and began aggressively turning away clients whose ethics didn't align with my vision. All of this massive wealth generation occurred precisely while Julian and his expensive legal team continued to characterize me in their formal court briefs as a struggling, entry-level bookkeeper entirely dependent on the generous financial support of her husband. His archaic perception of me as the naive, malleable small-town girl who was simply dazzled by his family's real estate holdings had completely calcified in his mind. His ego simply lacked the neurological capacity to conceive of my success existing completely independent of his shadow. During this frantic chapter of scaling, Vivienne formally introduced me to an elite syndicate of global angel investors looking to deploy massive capital into disruptive fintech platforms. My unique fusion of practical corporate logistics data and proprietary AI forecasting modeling impressed the board so thoroughly that they instantly offered an 8-figure seed round to fund a revolutionary corporate predictive application I had been quietly programming in my spare time. The platform, which utilized advanced neural networks to provide automated real-time financial risk assessment for businesses, launched its private beta to an absolutely overwhelming market response. Within a mere 6 months, the platform crossed 100,000 active corporate users, and we were actively fielding aggressive acquisition offers from some of the largest financial institutions on Wall Street. I strategically diversified my rapidly compounding personal wealth across international tech equities, premium commercial real estate, and high-yield venture funds, all hyper-insulated through a network of secure corporate holding structures designed to maximize exponential returns while keeping my digital signature entirely invisible to public asset registries. The night before our final, binding judicial court date, I sat completely alone in the sprawling Lake Forest estate that had never once felt like a genuine home, quietly processing the sheer scale of my journey. 7 years earlier, I had been so desperately eager to earn Julian's validation that I had willingly allowed him to chip away at my core identity. His betrayal, as visceral and painful as it was, had ultimately acted as the catalyst that forced me to reclaim my uncompromised intellect, my raw ambition, and my absolute sovereign worth. I quietly packed a single, sleek designer overnight bag. Regardless of whatever specific formulas the judge executed tomorrow, I had already resolved that I would never spend another single night inside the suffocating walls where my marriage had unraveled. My stunning new multi-million-dollar downtown penthouse apartment was completely ready for occupancy. Purchased entirely in cash through a private Delaware LLC Julian's legal team had absolutely zero knowledge of. Styled with exquisite, warm artwork and rich textures, chosen exclusively for their comfort and raw beauty rather than their capacity to project social status. As I zipped the leather bag shut, my phone vibrated on the marble counter with a direct text from Vivienne. It read, "Tomorrow morning, you step into that courtroom as the architect of your own empire, Alina. Do not let them treat you like a footnote in their story." With her words burning like pure electricity in my chest, I closed my eyes and prepared myself to execute the absolute final act of my marriage to Julian Vance. The morning of our final binding court date arrived, exceptionally clear and crisp. I dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue power suit, conservative yet radiating absolute confidence. I wore only a single piece of jewelry, a delicate platinum pendant that Sophia and Vivienne had gifted me to mark Vanguard's second anniversary. They had called it my sovereignty diamond. I arrived at the Cook County Courthouse precisely 30 minutes early, exactly as Rebecca had instructed. Julian was already pacing the marble hallway, looking impeccably expensive in a charcoal bespoke suit. Standing beside him was David Harrison, a senior partner at one of Chicago's most ruthless corporate litigation firms, notorious for extracting aggressive divorce settlements that completely insulated old money family wealth. The moment Julian caught sight of me, a patronizing smirk flashed across his face. He leaned over, whispering something into David's ear that caused both men to chuckle softly. Their confidence was completely palpable. To them, today was a mere bureaucratic formality before their inevitable, crushing victory. Rebecca arrived moments later, looking utterly immaculate in a deep burgundy suit that practically commanded the room. Unlike David and his excessive entourage of junior legal associates, Rebecca operated with silent, deadly precision. She exuded a quiet, absolute competence that had been my anchor from the very beginning. "Are you prepared, Alina?" she asked, her expression completely unreadable to the opposing team's watching eyes. "More than prepared," I replied, a calm smile playing on my lips. Judge Catherine Sterling's courtroom was intimidatingly austere. The judge herself, a woman in her late 50s with sharp silver hair and piercing, analytical eyes, carried a legendary reputation for unflinching fairness and zero tolerance for legal games or emotional theatrics. The moment the proceedings initiated, Julian delivered an absolute Oscar-worthy performance. His rehearsed testimony painted a portrait of a saintly, devoted husband who had tirelessly supported his wife's modest professional endeavors, only to be repaid with cold ingratitude and erratic, unreasonable demands. "I simply desire an equitable and peaceful resolution, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice perfectly modulated to project deeply reasonable disappointment. "I have generously offered Mrs. Vance a highly supportive settlement framework that would allow her to live comfortably while she attempts to rebuild her entry-level career." David Harrison then stepped up to confidently present their asset division proposal, heavily emphasizing that the Vance family real estate holdings were strictly untouchable separate property, completely minimizing my structural contributions to the marital estate, and aggressively demanding that the Lake Forest property remain entirely in Julian's possession. Throughout their entire theatrical presentation, I sat completely still, maintaining a perfectly flat demeanor. I neither reacted to Julian's fabricated slurs nor revealed a single shred of emotion. Judge Sterling occasionally glanced down from her bench toward me, her sharp expression entirely unreadable. When the moment finally arrived to sign the preliminary foundational divorce decree, permanently dissolving our marital status while the court finalized the residual asset distribution, Julian made an absolute spectacle of it. He signed the document with a dramatic flourish, a soft, arrogant laugh escaping his lips as he capped his luxury Montblanc pen. As he walked back to his seat, he passed close enough to my chair to whisper under his breath, "Enjoy crawling back to your parents' little house in Ohio, Alina." Then Rebecca stood up. Her presentation began methodically, a chilling structural contrast to David's theatrical arguments. She laid out cold, empirical data detailing Julian's severe financial deceptions during the marriage, the hidden offshore holdings, the lavish luxury spending directly on Alyssa, and a continuous, documented pattern of coercive financial control. "Your Honor," Rebecca stated, her voice echoing clearly through the silent room, "Mr. Vance has flagrantly violated Illinois law by failing to provide transparent financial disclosures regarding the full extent of marital assets." She smoothly submitted a massive binder of documentation exposing the secret accounts Julian had deliberately omitted, complete with exact dates, wire transfer routes, and certified balances. Julian shifted violently in his leather chair, his smug expression instantly evaporating into an anxious glance at David. David frantically stood up, requesting an immediate brief recess. Motion denied, counselor, Judge Sterling snapped coldly, not even looking up from the documents. I believe we will proceed immediately. I am deeply interested in reviewing these undisclosed marital holdings. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned instantly electric as Rebecca methodically dismantled Julian's entire financial credibility. Judge Sterling's expression grew increasingly stern with every single page she turned. Furthermore, Your Honor, Rebecca continued smoothly, we request that this court formally recognize Mrs. Vance's independent corporate enterprise, established during the marriage as exclusive separate property, due to the fact that Mr. Vance provided zero capital, zero support, and actively sabotaged its execution. This was the exact tactical trap we had spent months building. Judge Sterling paused, looking up from her desk. Please elaborate, Miss Torres. Mrs. Vance independently launched a high-level quantitative financial consulting firm during the marriage. Mr. Vance not only contributed absolutely zero capital to this venture, but actively belittled, discouraged, and dismissed her professional intellect, as explicitly detailed in these verified communications. Rebecca presented a chronological log of emails and text messages where Julian had directly mocked my business as a meaningless little data project and commanded me to ignore my entrepreneurial ambitions. Judge Sterling reviewed the printouts carefully before looking down to address me directly for the absolute first time. Mrs. Vance, this court demands complete, uncompromised financial disclosure from both parties. Have you submitted the finalized financial data regarding this specific corporate entity? Not yet, Your Honor, I replied, standing up calmly. My finalized, certified corporate financial statement is officially ready for judicial submission today. Rebecca handed the court clerk a sealed, thick white envelope containing Vanguard Analytical Solutions, comprehensive financial disclosure, the multi-million-dollar reality we had strategically withheld until this exact second of maximum impact. We request that the court thoroughly review Mrs. Vance's actual financial status before determining any final asset distribution formulas, Rebecca stated firmly. Judge Sterling nodded, slicing open the envelope. The entire courtroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence as she read the contents. Her silver eyebrows rose slightly, the absolute only indication of surprise from the otherwise fiercely composed judge. After what felt like a painful eternity, Judge Sterling looked up, her eyes locked onto the record. For the official record, I will now read the summary of Mrs. Vance's verified holdings. My heart hammered with pure adrenaline as she began to read. Vanguard Analytical Solutions, an algorithmic asset consulting firm established 3 years ago. Current independent valuation based on verified recurring revenue, institutional contracts, and proprietary intellectual property, $2,100,000. Julian's head snapped toward me so fast I thought his neck would break, his eyes completely wide with comical, unadulterated disbelief. Private investment portfolio, Judge Sterling continued levelly. Including technology equities, commercial real estate holdings, and early-stage venture capital assets, $11,900,000. Julian gripped the edge of his mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. Independent real estate holdings, 2 luxury residential properties purchased within the last 18 months, current valuation, $1,200,000. By this point, Julian looked physically nauseous, the color entirely drained from his face as his body went rigidly stiff with pure psychological shock. Beside him, David was frantically scribbling notes and whispering in a panic, but Julian seemed utterly incapable of processing the audio data entering his ears. Total verified personal assets, $15,200,000, Judge Sterling concluded, closing the folder with a sharp snap. The entire courtroom remained frozen. Julian stared at me across the aisle as if he were looking at an absolute stranger, a ghost he had failed to recognize in his own home. In that transcendent moment, I felt no childish triumph, no petty vindication. I felt only a profound, beautiful sense of liberation. The truth was finally written into the permanent record. Judge Sterling broke the silence, her voice cutting through the room like iron. Mr. Vance, do you wish to formally revise any of your previous sworn testimony regarding your wife's financial dependence on your family's capital? Julian opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. David Harrison scrambled to his feet immediately. Your Honor, our client was completely unaware of the existence of these massive assets. We aggressively contend that since these holdings were generated during the legal timeline of the marriage, Mr. Vance is legally entitled to an equitable 50% distribution of their total value. Rebecca was already standing, waiting for that exact predictable argument. Your Honor, we formally direct the court's attention to the original prenuptial framework executed by both parties prior to the marriage, specifically Clause 15. This was our ultimate ace. Years ago, when reviewing the contract Julian's family had forced me to sign, Rebecca had uncovered a brilliant loophole that Julian's own arrogant lawyers had inserted to protect his potential law firm partnerships. It explicitly stated, any independent business enterprise or corporate entity created by either spouse during the marriage without direct capital investment from the other spouse shall remain the exclusive separate property of the founding spouse in the absolute event of a divorce. The language drafted by the Vance family's own counsel is entirely unambiguous, Rebecca argued flawlessly. The clause applies perfectly to Mrs. Vance's consulting firm, which she constructed entirely from scratch without a single dollar of financial contribution from Mr. Vance. Judge Sterling reviewed the prenuptial text, a slow, appreciative nod forming as she read. The legal language is indeed ironclad, Counselor. Miss Torres, please conclude your remarks. Rebecca quickly outlined how I had built my shadow empire utilizing exclusively separate, entry-level savings and continuously compounding my independent profits, all while Julian actively sought to minimize my efforts. She submitted affidavits from Sophia, Vivienne, and institutional clients attesting to my sole execution of the business. Throughout her final remarks, I watched Julian. The powerful, patronizing man who had laughed while signing the divorce decree just hours earlier now sat entirely hollowed out, his constructed identity shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Alyssa, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the gallery, silently slipped out of the courtroom doors, her face pale and unreadable. Judge Sterling took a brief 20 minutes to review the collected data before returning to deliver her absolute, binding ruling. Based on the overwhelming financial evidence and the explicit, non-negotiable terms of the prenuptial agreement, Judge Sterling dictated, this court formally rules that Vanguard Analytical Solutions and the resulting $11.9 million investment portfolio constitute the exclusive separate property of Alina Vance. Julian let out a strangled, breathless sound from his throat. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice hardening, given Mr. Vance's deliberate, fraudulent failure to disclose marital assets under oath, this court is heavily inclined to divide the remaining marital property in a manner highly favorable to the plaintiff. The Lake Forest estate will be sold immediately, with 75% of the total net proceeds awarded directly to Mrs. Vance. The remainder of her specific judicial formulas blurred into background noise, but the macroeconomic macro outcome was crystalline. I had preserved my business, insulated my millions in investments, and secured the absolute majority of our actual marital assets due to Julian's own hubris. As we stood up to formally exit the courtroom, Julian violently intercepted me before his attorney could pull him back. You engineered this entire trap, he hissed, his face contorted with a venomous mixture of raw humiliation and unbridled rage. All these years you were just playing a role, waiting for the perfect moment to completely destroy my life. I stopped, looking at the man I had once foolishly loved, now recognizing him as nothing more than a small, insecure bully consumed by his own delusions. No, Julian, I said softly, my voice filled with pure, calm clarity. I simply built a kingdom while you were far too busy destroying our home. That is the fundamental difference in our data. You completely underestimated the girl you married. Rebecca gently placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me away and leaving Julian standing entirely alone in the center of the emptying room, the debris of his fragile superiority complex lying in complete shambles around his feet. Stepping out onto the courthouse steps that afternoon, the crisp Chicago wind hit my face, and the immense weight of the double life I had been forced to lead evaporated into thin air. Today, Vanguard Analytical Solutions has scaled into an international corporate powerhouse. My algorithmic portfolios continue to yield massive returns, and I have dedicated a significant portion of my capital to launching a global foundation that equips women with the technical data and financial resources required to build their own uncompromised independence. Julian actually attempted to initiate a pathetic reconciliation a year later once my verified net worth hit the financial wires, but I had already moved light years beyond the narrow horizon of the man he used to be. If you're reading this right now and finding yourself standing at your own terrifying crossroads of betrayal, isolation, or systematic underestimation, I need you to remember one absolute truth. Sometimes what feels like the catastrophic end of your world is actually the quiet, strategic beginning of your real empire. Your actual worth can never be calculated by someone else's inability to comprehend your value. Have you ever had someone in your life completely underestimate your mind, only for you to execute a strategy that proved them spectacularly wrong? Tell me your data story in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with your soul, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with a brilliant woman who needs to hear that her identity is never defined by anyone else's perception. Thank you for analyzing my journey with me. And never forget, sometimes losing exactly what you thought you wanted is the only calculation that leads you directly to what you truly deserve.